June 1943, Philippine Sea. Midnight. The ocean is flat and black, a mirror without stars. A Japanese convoy moves slowly through the darkness. Tankers heavy with oil, freighters stacked with ammunition, escorted by a thin screen of destroyers. Engines thrum in steady rhythm. On the bridge of the lead ship, sailors stare into the void, knowing the most dangerous enemy cannot be seen. Then the sea erupts. A white flash tears through the hull of the second tanker. Steel folds inward. Fire climbs skyward in a roaring column. Within seconds, the ship lists violently and begins to sink. Another explosion follows, closer now. A third ship shudders as torpedoes strike below the waterline. There is no warning, no aircraft, no surface flashes. Only silence beneath the waves. Depth charges thunder into the water in blind retaliation, detonating far from their unseen target. The convoy scatters in panic, engines screaming at full power, formation gone, order shattered. Far below, an American submarine slips quietly into the dark. In 1943, moments like this began to repeat across every Japanese sea lane. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's Navy realized something terrifying. The ocean no longer belonged to them. In the first year of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the sea lanes with near total confidence. From the ruins of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the rapid conquests of early 1942, Japan's naval power appeared unstoppable. Its carrier force struck across thousands of miles of ocean. Its surface fleets swept aside Allied resistance in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the South China Sea. Even its merchant shipping moved with a sense of inherited security born from decades of uncontested control. For Japanese planners, the sea was the empire's bloodstream. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from Indochina, food from Southeast Asia. Everything that sustained Japan's war effort traveled by ship. If those routes remained open, the empire could fight indefinitely. If they closed, the war would suffocate. Yet, in those early months, few in Tokyo truly feared American submarines. Before the war, U.S. submarine doctrine was defensive, cautious, and largely untested against a first-rate naval power. American submarines were spread thin across the Pacific. Their crews lacked combat experience. And worst of all, their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo fitted with the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, was deeply flawed. Torpedoes ran too deep. Detonators misfired. Contact pistols shattered on impact. Submarines would fire perfect attack solutions only to watch their torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath Japanese ships. Throughout 1942, U.S. submarines scored only limited success. Crew after crew returned in frustration. Some commanders began doubting their own judgment. Others suspected, but could not yet prove, that the torpedoes themselves were the problem. Meanwhile, American submarines paid for these failures in blood. Without decisive offensive success, their presence seemed more symbolic than strategic. Japanese naval leadership took notice. Initial Japanese anti-submarine measures were minimal. Convoys were rare. Escort numbers were small. Training in submarine detection lagged behind surface fleet gunnery and air operations, which the Japanese considered far more decisive. Sonar technology remained underdeveloped. Radar was scarce. Depth charge doctrine relied on visual spotting and limited hydrophone detection. To many senior officers, submarines were an annoyance, not a decisive threat. This belief was reinforced throughout 1942. Japanese shipping losses to submarines were real, but they did not yet threaten the empire's strategic flow of resources. Most losses were attributed to isolated patrols. Nothing yet suggested the kind of systematic destruction the German U-boat arm inflicted in the Atlantic. But beneath the surface of American frustration, change was coming. By late 1942, U.S. submarine commanders began taking matters into their own hands. Patrol reports grew increasingly detailed. Torpedo failure data accumulated. Some skippers risked court-martial by conducting unauthorized tests. What they uncovered was alarming. Torpedoes ran consistently too deep by as much as 10 feet. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or not at all. Contact pistols failed at oblique impact angles. It was a catastrophic revelation. In early 1943, after months of resistance, the U.S. Navy finally acknowledged the depth of the torpedo crisis. The Mark VI magnetic exploder was disabled. Depth-keeping mechanisms were recalibrated. Contact pistols were reinforced. Almost overnight, the American submarine force was rearmed with weapons that finally functioned as designed. At the same time, leadership of the Pacific submarine campaign passed into experienced hands. Admiral Charles Lockwood assumed command of the U.S. Pacific Submarine Force and immediately began reshaping doctrine. He demanded aggressive patrols. He insisted on relentless attacks. Most importantly, he understood that submarines could not merely hunt warships. They had to strangle Japan's merchant fleet. That strategic shift would change everything. By the opening months of 1943, American submarines were no longer just isolated predators at sea. They were becoming an organized weapon of economic warfare. And Japan's Navy, still confident in its layered surface strength, had not yet grasped what was quietly assembling beneath the waves. By the spring of 1943, the transformation of the American submarine force was no longer theoretical. It was operational. With torpedoes finally functioning as intended, U.S. submarines began to strike with a consistency that stunned even their own commanders. Patrol reports that once returned with frustration now returned with tonnage sunk. One ship became two became four, and soon entire convoys began to vanish without visible cause. For the first time, the Pacific War acquired a hidden front. Admiral Charles Lockwood understood that raw aggression alone would not win this underwater campaign. He reorganized patrol zones with a strategist's precision. Submarines were assigned to choke points, narrow passages between island chains, coastal shipping lanes near Formosa and the Philippines, and the long supply routes that connected Japan to its southern conquests. Each patrol box was chosen not for chance encounters, but for inevitability. If Japan wished to move oil, troops, or materials, it had to pass through waters now watched by silent American hunters. Coordination improved as well. While American submarines did not operate in true wolf packs like the German U-boats, Lockwood encouraged intelligence-based patrol overlap. Multiple submarines were assigned staggered positions along known shipping routes. Contact reports allowed other boats to intercept trailing convoys days later. The ocean, once vast and anonymous, began to feel mapped and monitored from below. Technology accelerated the advantage. American submarines were now equipped with improved surface search radar, giving them the unprecedented ability to detect ships at night and in heavy weather. Radar allowed submarines to fight as surface attack vessels after dark, approaching at high speed, firing torpedoes at close range, then crashing back beneath the waves before escorts could respond.
It was an entirely new form of naval warfare for the Pacific. Meanwhile, Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained dangerously outdated. Escort vessels were few and lightly armed. Sonar training was inconsistent and poorly standardized. Depth charges were limited in number and often deployed without proper pattern discipline. Japanese doctrine continued to emphasize surface fleet engagements and carrier battles, leaving convoy protection under-prioritized and under-resourced. Worst of all, Japanese leadership never unified its shipping defense under a single centralized command. Merchant fleets, naval escorts, and army-controlled transports often operated independently. Information moved slowly. Losses were underreported.
It was now statistical. By 1943, the most dangerous place in the Pacific was no longer the flight deck of a carrier or the bridge of a battleship. It was the deck of a slow-moving merchant ship. Japanese merchant sailors were not frontline warriors. Many were civilian crews pressed into war service. They sailed oil tankers, ore carriers, troop transports, ships with thin hulls and little protection. In the early war, they traveled with confidence. By mid-1943, they traveled with fear. Night was the worst. The ocean offered no warning. Submarines did not announce their presence. There was no roar of aircraft engines, no distant gun flashes. Only a sudden explosion beneath the keel. Ships vanished in minutes. Survivors described how the sea seemed calm until it killed them. Rumors spread faster than official reports. Sailors whispered about submarines following convoys for days. Others spoke of torpedoes that struck without contrails. Double hits, triple hits. Escorts exploding as they turned to help. Even seasoned crews began to hesitate when ordered to sea. The psychological toll was immense. Lifeboat drills became routine. Personal effects were wrapped in oilcloth and tied to belts. Some sailors slept in their clothes, knowing they might have seconds to escape. Unlike air battles, where danger was visible and fleeting, submarine warfare was prolonged terror. Every vibration in the hull, every shifting shadow on the water, every distant splash created dread. By late 1943, Japan's merchant fleet was not just being destroyed physically, it was being broken emotionally. Angle 2, the technological angle, how American submarines became hunters. The transformation of the U.S. submarine force in 1943 was driven not by a single invention, but by a convergence of technologies finally working together. The most important change was the torpedo fix. Once depth-keeping errors were corrected and faulty exploders removed, American submarines at last possessed reliable weapons. Torpedoes now ran true. Detonations occurred on contact. One hit was often enough. Radar followed. Surface search radar turned night into daylight for submarine commanders. Boats could track convoys from miles away, maneuver ahead of them, and launch attacks under cover of darkness. The submarine was no longer purely an underwater ambush vessel. It became a surface raider that could vanish at will. Sonar detection from escorts lagged far behind radar detection by submarines. This imbalance made American boats tactically superior in pursuit, firing, and escape. Fire control systems improved as well. Torpedo data computers allowed for faster targeting. Crews drilled relentlessly. Crew coordination sharpened with every successful patrol. The American submarine was now a precision weapon. Speed came from confidence. Confidence came from results. And once that cycle began, it did not stop. Angle 3, the tactical angle, how American submarines turned sea lanes into kill zones. Japanese shipping did not move randomly. It followed predictable routes shaped by geography, fuel economy, and port infrastructure. American intelligence learned these patterns and exploited them. Submarines waited at narrow straits. They patrolled coastal approaches. They lingered near harbor exits.
They stalked convoy lanes from Indonesia through the South China Sea toward Japan. Once contact was made, commanders chose their moment. Attacks often began at night on the surface. A submarine approached at high speed, positioned ahead of the convoy, and fired a spread of torpedoes into the densest cluster of ships. One hit would panic the formation. Others followed seconds later. Escorts responded blindly. By the time depth charges detonated behind the submarine's last known position, the boat was already slipping away beneath thermal layers of cold water where sonar struggled to follow. Convoy doctrine fell apart under this stress. Ships scattered instead of holding formation. Escorts abandoned damaged vessels to chase phantoms. Order collapsed into confusion, the exact environment submarines thrived in. By mid-1943, Japan's sea lanes were no longer roads. They were minefields without mines. And every transit became a gamble with death. At the center of America's submarine rise in 1943 stood one man with a relentless focus on results: Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood. Unlike many senior officers, Lockwood listened closely to the captains returning from patrol. When they reported torpedo failures, he did not dismiss them. He tested their claims. When they described flawed doctrine, he altered it. Lockwood reshaped submarine warfare around three core principles: aggression, intelligence, and persistence. Boats were pushed into high traffic areas instead of wide patrol arcs. Captains were encouraged to attack boldly rather than preserve their vessels. Success was measured not in survival, but in tonnage destroyed. Japanese leadership operated under a very different structure. Shipping defense was fragmented between naval districts, convoy escorts, and army transport commands. No unified authority commanded Japan's anti-submarine war. Escort production lagged behind carrier and aircraft construction. Training and sonar work remained secondary. Even as shipping losses climbed, the system adjusted slowly. Lockwood exploited this institutional delay mercilessly. Where the U.S. Navy adapted week by week, Japanese command adapted year by year. The difference was fatal. By the end of 1943, American submarine warfare had become methodical destruction. Japan's response remained improvised defense. Angle 5, enemy perspective angle. Japanese escort officers fight an invisible war. For Japanese escort commanders, 1943 became a year of frustration and helplessness. Depth charges were dropped into empty water. Sonar contacts flickered uncertainly across poorly calibrated receivers. Hydrophone operators strained to separate echoes from imagination. Often, the first clear sign of a submarine's presence was the explosion itself. Escorts were forced into reactive warfare. They defended convoys whose routes they did not control. They hunted enemies they could not consistently locate. They protected ships they could not physically shield. Each successful American attack eroded confidence further. Survivor testimony speaks of exhaustion and despair. Escorts raced between burning wrecks and unseen threats. Every maneuver risked exposing another vulnerable ship. No matter how aggressively they hunted, the submarines slipped away into darkness and thermoclines that sonar could not penetrate. What frightened them most was the consistency. If attacks had been rare, they could have been endured. But by late 1943, they came steadily, relentlessly, predictably. For Japanese escort officers, the war beneath the waves became a fight they could neither win nor escape. In Japan's wartime doctrine, merchant sailors existed in an uneasy space between civilian life and military necessity. They did not carry rifles. They did not fight in formation. Yet by 1943, their survival had become as critical as that of any frontline soldier. Tanker crews carried fuel that powered fighters. Freighter sailors transported steel that built warships. Troop transports delivered entire divisions to distant islands. Each merchant sailor became an unarmed participant in total war. The Americans understood this brutal reality. Their submarine campaign did not target honor or bravery. It targeted infrastructure, oil, food, ammunition, ships. For Japanese sailors, this produced devastating moral dissonance. They were not aggressors at the point of attack. They were targets because the system demanded it. Results were impersonal. Starvation followed months later. Aircraft grounded far from the sinking point. Factories would later slow. The destruction was quiet, distant, and absolute. And by the end of 1943, Japan's economy was bleeding invisibly across thousands of miles of ocean. Mid-1943, the Western Pacific, the South China Sea, and the approaches to the home islands. By the middle of 1943, the underwater war against Japan reached a threshold where loss could no longer be dismissed as misfortune. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a pattern it could not rationalize away. American submarines were no longer striking occasionally. They were striking everywhere. Shipping losses surged. Tankers vanished off Borneo. Troop ships exploded in the Luzon Strait. Ore carriers burned in the East China Sea. Day after day, reports arrived that could not be concealed. Entire convoys failed to arrive. Survivors brought the same story each time. Torpedoes without warning, escorts powerless, attackers never seen. The most alarming target was oil. Japan's entire war machine depended on a narrow pipeline of fuel stretching from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands. There was no alternative source, no strategic.
American commanders began initiating attacks not to sink just one ship, but to dissolve entire convoys. A single tanker would be struck first, igniting fires and forcing escorts into disarray. Moments later, torpedoes would tear into troop ships or freighters attempting to flee. By the time order could be restored, the submarines were already repositioning for additional strikes. In multiple actions, a single American submarine sank 4 or 5 ships in a single patrol. These were no longer isolated victories, they were systemic breakdowns. Japan's inner circle confronts the truth. By the winter of 1943, shipping statistics became impossible to conceal. The Naval General Staff and the Ministry of Munitions compared production output with delivery figures and saw the gap widening. Oil stocks declined faster than replenishment. Steel shipments dropped. Food imports began to strain civilian reserves. Entire stockpiles vanished between Southeast Asia and Japan itself. For the first time, Japanese planners calculated that even if the fleet survived intact, it could not be sustained. Carrier groups became floating fortresses without fuel. Training squadrons were grounded. Warships that once patrolled freely now remained at anchor to conserve precious resources. Strategic mobility, which had fueled Japan's early conquests, evaporated. The terror was not only physical, it was psychological. Admirals no longer debated how to defeat American submarines. They debated how long Japan could survive under their pressure. A war that could not be fought back. The vulnerability that haunted Japan's Navy was not simply technological, it was structural. Submarines did not require domination of air or sea. They slipped beneath both. Every defensive measure depended on detection, and detection remained unreliable. Sonar struggled. Hydrophones confused echoes. Radar was nearly useless against submerged targets. Depth charges became symbolic gestures. Submarines absorbed explosions, descended below thermoclines, and waited until the hunters exhausted their ammunition and fuel. Then they returned. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine had been built on interception and pursuit. But pursuit required an enemy that could be chased. The American submarines offered no such opportunity. They attacked. They vanished. They returned. This impossibility of decisive response broke the traditional logic of naval warfare. Battleships could be engaged, carriers could be hunted, aircraft could be intercepted. Submarines denied every one of those comforts. The fleet becomes a prison. By late 1943, Japan's mighty fleet was still afloat, but it was increasingly trapped inside a shrinking strategic cage. Every sortie risked exposing fuel supplies. Every redeployment required tanker support vulnerable to ambush. Even defensive repositioning became dangerous. The Navy that had once projected power across the entire Pacific now hesitated before a single crossing. This was the true turning point. Not the sinking of a flagship, not the destruction of a task force, but the moment Japan's Navy realized that movement itself had become lethal. And beneath every chart table, behind every operations map, a silent, inescapable truth took hold. The ocean that once carried the empire forward was now poisoning it from within. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the consequences of America's underwater campaign began to surface far beyond the shipping lanes where the attacks had taken place. What had been invisible destruction at sea now translated into visible paralysis across Japan's war economy and military operations. The effects moved steadily outward, from fuel depots to airfields, from factories to frontline units. The most immediate impact was felt in fuel shortages. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, once the lifeblood of the Imperial Navy, collapsed under sustained submarine attack. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Storage reserves dwindled month by month. Carrier task forces that once trained at sea now rationed their maneuvers to conserve fuel. Destroyers shortened patrols. Even basic fleet coordination began to suffer as ships remained at anchor awaiting scarce refueling opportunities. For Japan's air power, the consequences were devastating. Training flights were among the first activities to be curtailed. New pilots, already receiving drastically reduced instruction, now flew even fewer hours. The quality of replacement aircrews dropped precipitously. Experienced pilots were forced to carry a greater burden in combat, increasing fatigue and losses. Aircraft sat idle on runways, not because they were broken, but because there was no fuel to fly them. Industry soon followed. Japan's factories depended on imported raw materials: iron ore from Southeast Asia, bauxite for aluminum, coal and rubber for manufacturing. As shipping losses mounted, production figures fell. Aircraft output declined. Engine plants operated below capacity. Ammunition deliveries lagged behind battlefield demand. The submarine campaign had begun to sever the physical connection between Japan's empire and its industrial heart. The psychological impact inside Japan was equally corrosive. For the first time, civilians experienced shortages that could not be concealed by propaganda. Food rations tightened. Transportation slowed. Coastal shipping, once considered safe, became sporadic. News of sinkings filtered through families with sons at sea. Ports received fewer arrivals. Docks grew quiet. Inside the Naval Ministry, the reality became undeniable. The war was no longer being lost in the air or on distant islands alone. It was being lost in the invisible expanse between ports. Japanese escort forces attempted a late expansion. More destroyers and small escorts were commissioned. Convoy systems became mandatory on key routes. Sonar training intensified. But each of these efforts faced a fatal limitation: time. Production could not outpace destruction. Training could not catch up with experience lost. Fuel scarcity undermined every reform, even as it was implemented. American submarines, meanwhile, intensified operations with growing confidence.
Patrol areas expanded closer to Japan's inner sea lanes. Boats operated in shallower coastal waters once considered too dangerous. They waited near harbor entrances. They observed shipping schedules. They selected high-value targets with cold efficiency. By early 1944, the submarine campaign had become a strangulation rather than a contest. Japan was no longer reacting to enemy moves. It was reacting to shortages. Every strategic decision became shaped by what could still move, what could still sail, and what could still be fueled. The Japanese Navy remained intact in appearance. Battleships still floated. Carriers still existed on paper. But the mobility that had once defined their power was slipping away. And with it, the empire's ability to wage modern war. By mid-1944, the full consequences of America's underwater campaign against Japan had become irreversible. What had begun as raiding warfare in 1943 had become a comprehensive maritime blockade in practice, one enforced not by surface fleets but by silent patrols beneath the sea. The Navy without fuel. Japan's once mighty fleet now faced a grim paradox. It still possessed warships, but could no longer afford to move them freely. Fuel shortages forced the Imperial Japanese Navy into a defensive crouch. Some capital ships were relegated to harbor as stationary deterrents. Training exercises were canceled or reduced to symbolic maneuvers. Even routine escort operations were scaled back as bunker oil became more precious than armor plating. Carrier operations, the pride of Japan's early war victories, were hit especially hard. Without adequate fuel, flight training declined. Deck crews lost proficiency. Pilots flew fewer hours. The very skills that had made Japan's naval air arm lethal in 1941 began to erode from simple immobility. Ships that once projected power across the Pacific became floating fortresses tied to the pier. Industry soon followed. On land, the shortages grew more visible and more damaging. Aircraft factories slowed for lack of aluminum and aviation fuel. Steel delivery interruptions delayed ship construction and repairs. Electrical power hiccups disrupted production schedules. Japan's industrial system, geared toward continuous flow from overseas resources, had no buffer